Chinese workers are abandoning coastal cities, and the fallout from the latest US-China tariffs has triggered a migration wave no one saw coming. Entire factories are emptying. Once-bustling ports now echo with silence, and it all started just over a month ago, when an economic shock rippled across the Pacific. If you want to understand how tariffs can uproot millions and reshape China's economy overnight, you're in the right place, because what's happening now could change global trade forever. What triggered tens of thousands of Chinese workers to suddenly flee the very cities that built China's economic rise? How did one tariff decision from Washington spark chaos in factories from Shenzhen to Shanghai overnight? And could this mass migration signal the collapse of China's export powerhouse as we know it? To understand how we got here, we have to rewind to the exact moment the latest tariff war ignited. The day the tariff war reignited. The United States officially unleashed $100 billion worth of new tariffs on Chinese electronics, machinery, and consumer goods. And these weren't small changes. Overnight, tariff rates on China's biggest exports skyrocketed from 10% to a punishing 54%. Semiconductors, solar panels, EV batteries all hit hard. To put that into perspective, a Lenovo laptop that once cost $800 in the US, it was now projected to soar to $1,100 almost instantly, a price jump that would slam American consumers and devastate Chinese manufacturers. The US justified the move with two sharp accusations: forced technology transfers and unfair industrial subsidies. The message from Washington was crystal clear, as US Trade Representative Sarah Donnelly boldly declared that morning, "Today, we reclaim fair competition, no more industrial manipulation." But what happened next caught even seasoned economists off guard. Within just 48 hours, Beijing struck back. China retaliated with mirror tariffs of its own, targeting U.S. agricultural imports and energy exports. Tariffs on American goods surged from 12% to 30% overnight. Suddenly, panic rippled through China's factory heartlands. Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Ningbo. In these powerhouse cities, whispers of canceled export orders turned into frantic meetings and emergency calls. Liang Chen, a factory supervisor in Shenzhen, summed up the fear best. He told reporters, "By April 5th, our biggest American clients froze all orders. Workers were already packing. Assembly lines slowed, shipping containers sat idle, and managers faced a harsh reality. If the orders don't come, neither do the paychecks." By April 10th, just 8 days after the initial U.S. announcement, the first wave of layoffs hit. In Guangdong province alone, 25,000 factory workers were furloughed. Entire floors of workers disappeared overnight. Dormitories emptied out. Buses shuttled laid-off workers back to rural provinces. The machine that powered China's export miracle was suddenly grinding to a halt. But this was just the beginning. Factories collapse, workers flee. By mid-April 2025, the fallout from the liberation tariffs was undeniable. What began as a ripple of uncertainty had turned into a tidal wave of shutdowns. Large multinational factories, the giants that anchored China's coastal cities, started scaling back in ways no one had seen since the 2008 financial crisis. Foxconn, BYD, major Lenovo suppliers, all of them began closing entire production lines. At Foxconn's sprawling Shenzhen plant, managers issued a stark internal memo. It simply read, "Evaporated export demand." By April 15, Foxconn halted 40% of its assembly line operations in Shenzhen alone. For a factory complex that once churned out millions of smartphones, laptops, and consumer electronics each month, it was a stunning reversal. Conveyor belts ground to a stop. Forklifts sat motionless. Entire sections of the factory floor, usually bustling with thousands of workers in blue uniforms, now stood eerily silent. And Foxconn wasn't alone. BYD, China's largest EV battery maker, announced it would shutter 2 of its major battery lines in Guangdong province. Lenovo supply chain contractors followed suit, laying off line workers as overseas orders disappeared overnight. But the statistics only tell part of the story. It's what happened to the people inside these factories that reveal the true depth of the crisis. Zhao Min, a 28-year-old assembly worker in Guangzhou, had worked on the smartphone production line for 7 years. Day in, day out, assembling screens, testing circuits, packaging finished devices bound for American shelves. On April 17th, she was called into a supervisor's office and handed a termination slip. Her severance, just 2 weeks' pay. Zhao later told a local reporter, I couldn't afford rent by April 20th. I had to go back to my village in Hunan with my daughter. Her story wasn't unique. In factory dormitories across Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and Ningbo, scenes unfolded that hadn't been seen in decades. Migrant workers stuffing their belongings into suitcases. Bus terminals packed with laid-off workers holding plastic bags, pushing baby strollers, carrying rice cookers, all heading home. The numbers soon painted a staggering picture. By April 25th, China's Ministry of Human Resources and Social Security confirmed over 600,000 migrant workers had left coastal provinces. 600,000 people gone in less than a month, returning to rural hometowns in Hunan, Henan, Sichuan, and beyond. For local governments in these inland provinces, the sudden return of so many workers posed a dangerous challenge. Job markets in those areas were already strained. Now they were on the verge of collapse. And for China's policymakers in Beijing, the alarm bells weren't just about economic numbers anymore. This mass migration was beginning to threaten something even more fragile: social stability. But for China's policymakers, this mass migration wasn't just about jobs. It was about social stability. By late April, as tens of thousands of workers poured back into their hometowns, the pressure on inland provinces became overwhelming. In Hunan province, local job centers reported lines stretching around the block, desperate returnees trying to register for even low-wage farming or construction work. In Henan, temp agencies slashed wages by up to 30% as the influx of workers flooded the market. In Sichuan, provincial officials quietly released emergency housing subsidies just to prevent a wave of homelessness in smaller towns. Village schools faced overcrowding as families who had lived in cities for years abruptly returned. Local hospitals, already strained by rural healthcare shortages, saw patient numbers spike. What started as a trade dispute was now tearing at the fabric of China's rural heartland. However, what happened next shocked everyone. Ghost cities and empty factories. By the end of April 2025, the economic fallout from the US-China tariff war had fully reached the industrial heartlands of China. What were once bustling factory towns and coastal cities like Shenzhen's Baohan district and Ningbo's industrial parks had turned into ghost cities. Factories that had once employed thousands of workers now struggled to keep their lines running. It wasn't just the shutdowns, it was the massive workforce disappearance. Entire districts watched as their labor forces shrank by 40 to 60% in just weeks. Take, for instance, a 10,000-worker electronics plant in Ningbo. By May 1st, it was staggering to watch the factory's once busy halls and assembly lines. Only 3,500 workers were still around, trying to keep operations going as best they could. Empty workstations, vacant dormitories, warehouses filled with unsold inventory, gathering dust. It wasn't just a temporary dip in the labor force, this was the sudden evaporation of an entire workforce. Thousands of migrant workers gone overnight. The immediate effects of this mass departure were felt in every corner of the economy. But it wasn't just the factories that were impacted. The real estate market, the backbone of the coastal city economies, began to collapse. In cities like Shenzhen and Guangzhou, real estate prices, particularly in rental markets, plummeted. Between April 27th and May 10th, rental prices dropped by 15% in just 2 weeks. For landlords like Wang Jiahao, it was a disaster. He had spent years managing dozens of rental properties in Dongguan, a smaller city on the outskirts of Guangzhou. In March, he had 40 tenants. By May 1st, only 6 remained. Wang's story wasn't an isolated case. Other landlords in Dongguan, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou reported similarly catastrophic losses. Apartments that once fetched high rents were now sitting empty, with no tenants willing or able to pay. I never thought it could happen so fast, Wang shared, looking over the half-empty apartment complex that had once buzzed with life. In just a few weeks, everything changed. The tenants left, and with them, my income. But the economic collapse wasn't limited to the rental market. The ghost towns also started to breed new, unsettling problems. Crime. As workers abandoned the coastal cities in droves, neighborhoods that had once been filled with people and activity were now left abandoned. What followed was a spike in minor theft and squatting. Desperate individuals moved into empty homes, looting whatever they could, while criminal gangs took advantage of the lack of law enforcement presence in these now quiet areas. Local authorities were stretched thin, trying to deal with the new social unrest in abandoned neighborhoods. Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and Ningbo saw a rise in petty crime, while some areas saw squatting become a widespread issue. And with this lawlessness, citizens became more anxious. Residents worried about their safety in neighborhoods that were once vibrant, now eerily still, and Beijing wasn't about to let this spiral out of control. On May 3, 2025, China's central government made a bold move to stabilize the situation. They announced the Reverse Migration Stabilization Grants, a program designed to curb the growing crisis in coastal cities. These relocation grants were meant to incentivize workers to return to inland provinces, easing the strain on both the labor market and the social fabric. For workers who left the coastal cities to return home, the government would offer 3,000 yuan, roughly 415 USD per person. The goal was simple: to prevent a larger collapse of social order in the coastal cities while ensuring that migrant workers would at least have a buffer to survive in their rural hometowns. Though the government's intervention provided some relief, it was a mere drop in the ocean compared to the damage already done. Supply chains break, global markets react. By early May 2025, the impact of the US-China tariff war had spread far beyond China's borders, hitting global markets hard. Chinese production had come to a near standstill, and with it, the very supply chains that kept the world's industries running. Electric vehicle, EV batteries, consumer electronics, and solar panels, critical sectors, were all facing severe disruptions. One example stood out: Tesla's Shanghai Gigafactory, a crucial hub for battery production. Tesla's Shanghai plant reported a 50% slowdown in shipments of batteries to both Europe and the United States. The company's Q2 delivery targets for EVs were now impossible to meet, according to the VP of supply chains at Tesla. Our Q2 delivery targets are now impossible, the VP said. This wasn't just a hiccup. This was a logistical nightmare. The company was unable to meet the demand for EVs, both in the US and Europe. That's a major loss in revenue and customer trust. As Chinese factories ground to a halt, the effects rippled across the globe. US electronics retailers were hit hardest, having relied heavily on Chinese-made goods. Retailers like Best Buy and Amazon had no choice but to hike prices on Chinese-made electronics by as much as 20 to 30%. Consumer electronics from laptops to smartphones were now far more expensive, and customers began to feel the pinch. It wasn't just the consumers who were impacted. Importers and distributors faced huge losses, with some businesses barely managing to stay afloat. One of those affected was Vincent Tan, a Malaysian electronics importer who depended on steady shipments from China to fulfill orders for his clients in Singapore. He was shocked by the rapid collapse of his pipeline. I've lost 80% of my shipment pipeline. My clients in Singapore are furious, Tan said, looking at the shattered remains of his inventory. I'm barely holding it together. Everyone is looking at me like I failed them. But China's internal economic crisis was just as devastating. On May 8, 2025, official figures confirmed just how deep the crisis had gone. China's export volume had fallen by an alarming 21% year over year. This marked the largest drop in exports since the global financial crisis of 2009. The domino effect had fully taken hold, with both global markets and China's own economy now teetering on the brink. The once thriving manufacturing powerhouse was suddenly under heavy pressure, with a near total freeze in the flow of goods. The global economy wasn't the only one feeling the shockwaves. China's own economic trajectory had been severely altered. The trade war, which had begun with a few tariff increases, had now become a full-blown crisis. And the final blow came just days later: the long-term fallout. By May 9th to 11th, 2025, the warning signs of a deeper crisis were becoming impossible to ignore. Analysts had begun to call this the second wave migration. The workers who had initially stayed, holding out hope that the worst was over, were now packing up and leaving in larger numbers. In Dongguan, one of China's key apparel production hubs, a staggering 10,000 workers had left over the May Day weekend alone. As the trade war's economic toll continued to mount, more workers in Guangdong and Zhejiang provinces followed suit, disillusioned and unable to see any clear path to economic recovery. To stem the bleeding, local governments in Guangdong and Zhejiang began offering emergency subsidies to workers in an effort to retain them. The promises were alluring: extra bonuses, tax relief, and temporary housing assistance, but workers had become cynical. They had seen the mass layoffs, the factory shutdowns, and the long lines of migrant workers waiting at bus stations. Would these subsidies actually bring long-term stability? Or were they just another short-term fix in a situation that was spiraling out of control? The economic despair on the coast was palpable, and many workers, already financially strained, were losing faith in the idea that this crisis would end anytime soon.
中方必将
Professor Zhang Wei, a respected economist from Fudan University, shared his unsettling analysis of the situation. This is not a temporary dip. We are witnessing the structural deindustrialization of the coast. The factories aren't coming back, and the workers are leaving for good. For the workers who had spent their lives in the coastal industrial hubs, this felt like the end of an era that has shaped the very backbone of China's economic rise. Adding to the anxiety, local governments were now facing rising concerns of real estate defaults and local debt crises. With millions of people leaving coastal cities, demand for housing plummeted. Vacancies grew, rental markets collapsed, and local governments, already stretched thin from providing subsidies, could not keep up. Inland provinces, already struggling with high unemployment, faced the added pressure of an influx of workers with no clear job prospects. Tension-building statement. And for China's leadership, the nightmare was now in full swing. As of today, the true scale of the crisis had come into view. Over 1.3 million workers had left China's coastal cities, according to the Ministry of Labor. The number of departures was staggering, and the damage to China's manufacturing economy was irreversible. Factory output in key sectors, including electronics, textiles, and auto parts, had dropped by a shocking 35 to 40%, compared to levels seen just 2 months prior in March. What was once a thriving, bustling industrial machine had now been reduced to a shadow of its former self. For the first time, China's economic planners were faced with the very real prospect of a catastrophic slowdown. Analysts were now forecasting that China's Q2 GDP growth could dip below 2%, the lowest growth rate in years. This was no longer just an economic slowdown. It was a full-blown economic crisis, a crisis that was affecting the global supply chain, and more importantly, undermining China's place as the world's manufacturing giant. For millions of Chinese workers, the factories that once fueled the nation's meteoric rise to economic power have now become symbols of a lost future. The bustling assembly lines, which were once a beacon of opportunity for those seeking work and prosperity, are now empty. Their workers scattered across the countryside or left stranded in cities that have no jobs to offer. As mass migration continues and factories collapse, the dreams of a better life in the coastal cities crumble. The staggering layoffs, wage freezes, and broken promises have forced these workers to face a harsh reality, one where they may never return to the industrial jobs that once defined them. For China, the economic turmoil is not just an internal crisis. It has rippled across the world, reshaping global markets and shaking the foundation of international trade. As the dust settles, both China and the world are left grappling with a daunting question. What comes next? Will the coastal cities ever regain their former glory? Or have we just witnessed the beginning of a new, uncertain chapter for China's economic future?